In the middle of a frozen battlefield, surrounded by advancing enemy soldiers, one man climbed onto a burning tank destroyer and opened fire. He was alone, outnumbered, with no guarantee of survival, and yet he did not retreat. The soldiers advancing toward him could not understand what they were seeing. One man, fully exposed, holding his ground against an entire force that should have overwhelmed him in seconds. What followed would become one of the most unbelievable acts of courage ever recorded in war. But that moment did not begin there. It began with a boy no one expected much from. Audie Murphy was born into poverty, raised in a world where survival came before anything else. Life was not structured or secure. It was harsh, unpredictable, and often unforgiving. From a young age, he learned what it meant to take responsibility, not because he wanted to, but because he had no other choice. His family struggled constantly. Food was not always guaranteed, stability was rare. As the years passed, the weight of responsibility grew heavier. When his father left, it did not just change the household. It forced Murphy into a role that most boys his age could not imagine. He became a provider. Hunting was no longer a skill. It was a necessity. Every shot mattered. Every decision carried consequences. He learned patience, precision, and control not in a training ground, but in the fields and forests where failure meant going hungry. These early years shaped something deeper: discipline without comfort, strength without recognition, and a quiet determination that did not need to be seen to exist. When the United States entered World War II, thousands of young men saw it as a call to serve. For Murphy, it was something more: an opportunity, a way out. A chance to step into something greater than the life he had known. But even then, nothing came easy. He was turned away at first, too small, too light, not what the military was looking for. To most, that would have been the end of it. But Murphy had spent his entire life being told what he could not do, and he had learned not to accept it. He tried again, and this time he was accepted. Training began like it did for everyone else. Long days, strict discipline, constant pressure to perform. But there was something different about him. While others were adapting to hardship, he was already familiar with it. He did not stand out because he spoke louder. He stood out because he endured. He learned quickly, moved with purpose, paid attention. Where others hesitated, he acted, not recklessly, but with a kind of clarity that came from years of having no room for mistakes. Still, no one could have predicted what he would become, because at that moment he was just another soldier. Young. Unproven, unknown. War has a way of changing that, because training prepares you for the idea of combat, but nothing prepares you for the reality. And soon Murphy would step into a world where everything he had learned would be tested under conditions that do not forgive hesitation. A place where decisions are made in seconds, where fear is constant, and where survival depends on what you do when everything around you begins to fall apart. He was about to find out what kind of man he truly was. Because the battlefield was waiting, and it would not be what anyone expected. The first time he stepped into combat, there was no announcement, no moment to prepare for what it would feel like. One moment he was moving with his unit, following orders, focused on the objective ahead. The next, the world around him changed. Gunfire, explosions, voices shouting over the chaos. The battlefield did not ease him into its reality. It forced him into it all at once. For Audie Murphy, everything he had learned until that moment was suddenly tested under pressure that could not be recreated in training. The noise alone was overwhelming. The unpredictability, the constant awareness that at any second everything could end. Men moved forward, then dropped. Some kept going, others did not get back up. Orders came quickly, sometimes lost in the sound of gunfire. The line between control and chaos was thin, and it shifted without warning. This was war. Not the idea of it, the reality. Murphy did not freeze, he moved. Instinct, discipline, and something deeper took over. He stayed low, observed, reacted. Every step was calculated, every movement tied to survival. He began to understand quickly that hesitation was dangerous, that waiting too long could cost more than just position. It could cost lives. The unit pushed forward under fire, advancing through terrain that offered little protection. The enemy was not always visible, but their presence was constant. Shots came from positions that were difficult to identify. The ground itself felt uncertain, every inch contested. Murphy adapted. He watched the men around him, learned from them, followed when necessary, acted when needed. He did not try to stand out, he tried to stay effective. And slowly something began to change. The fear did not disappear, but it became controlled, focused. He began to move with more confidence, not because the danger had lessened, but because he was learning how to function within it. The chaos started to make sense. Patterns emerged. Reactions became faster. He was no longer just surviving, he was operating. There were moments when the situation shifted suddenly, when the line broke, when confusion spread and decisions had to be made without guidance. In those moments, Murphy did not wait, he acted, moving toward positions that needed support. Covering areas that were exposed, taking initiative when others hesitated. It did not go unnoticed. The men around him began to see it, not in a single moment but over time, in the way he carried himself, in the way he responded under pressure, in the way he kept moving forward when stopping would have been easier. Respect in war is not given easily. It is earned, and Murphy was earning it, but war does not allow time to settle into confidence. Just as quickly as a soldier begins to understand it, the situation changes again. The missions became harder, the resistance stronger, the stakes higher. What had once been intense now became relentless. The unit was sent into more dangerous operations, facing enemy forces that were better positioned, more prepared, and unwilling to give ground. Every advance required more effort. Every gain came with greater risk. Losses increased. The reality of war became heavier. Friends were no longer just men in the same unit. They became names that would not be called again, faces that would not return. The cost of every movement forward became more personal, and still the orders continued. Move forward, hold position, advance. Murphy felt the weight of it, but he did not step back. If anything, he stepped further in, because something had changed inside him. The boy who had entered the war looking for opportunity was no longer the same. The battlefield had shaped him into something else. Someone who did not wait for direction when action was needed. Someone who did not look away when others fell. Someone who understood that in moments of pressure, what you do matters more than what you feel. And the war was far from over, because ahead of him were battles that would push him beyond anything he had faced so far. Situations where the odds would not just be against him, they would be overwhelming. And in those moments, there would be no room for doubt, only action, because soon he would find himself in a position where standing his ground would not just be a choice. It would be the only thing between survival and complete collapse. The battles became more intense as the war pushed deeper into occupied territory. What had once felt unpredictable now became constant. There were no quiet moments, no true breaks from the pressure. Every movement forward carried the expectation of resistance, and every position gained came with the understanding that it could be taken back just as quickly. Audie Murphy was no longer adjusting to war. He was part of it. His unit moved through towns and forests that had already felt the weight of conflict. Buildings reduced to fragments. Roads marked by tracks of heavy movement. The signs of what had come before them were everywhere, and they served as a warning of what could happen again at any moment. Engagements became more frequent. The enemy was organized, disciplined, and determined. They did not retreat easily. Positions were defended with precision, forcing every advance to be earned. It was no longer about pushing forward quickly. It was about surviving long enough to hold ground. Murphy moved with increasing confidence, but not without awareness. He understood the cost of mistakes. He had seen it too many times. That understanding shaped the way he acted, controlled, focused, ready to respond without hesitation. There were moments when the line faltered, when confusion spread, when the situation became uncertain. And in those moments, Murphy stepped forward, not to stand out, but because someone had to. He began to take on responsibilities that went beyond what was expected of him. Supporting positions under pressure. Moving through exposed ground to reach those who needed help. Holding his place when others were forced to fall back. Each action carried risk. Each decision could have gone differently, but he continued to move forward. The men around him noticed. Not just the actions, but the consistency. The way he remained steady when situations became unstable. The way he did not allow panic to take control, even when everything around him suggested it should. Trust grew. Quietly. Built through moments that did not need explanation. But war has a way of escalating. Just when a soldier begins to understand the level of danger, it rises. The missions became more complex. The resistance more aggressive. The margin for error smaller, and with that the cost increased. Murphy experienced it directly. Wounds, close calls, moments where survival came down to seconds, each one leaving a mark, not always visible but always present. And still he remained. Not because he did not feel the weight of it, but because he chose to carry it. As the unit continued its advance, they were sent into operations that required more than just movement. They required holding ground under pressure, defending positions against forces that were not only prepared but determined to break through. These were the moments where everything could change, where a single position could decide the outcome of an entire engagement. And Murphy would soon find himself in one of those moments, a situation where the line would not just be tested, it would be pushed to the edge of collapse, where numbers would not be in his favor, where retreat would seem like the only option, and where the decision to stand would carry consequences that could not be reversed, because what was coming next would not be a test of skill alone, it would be a test of resolve, and in that moment there would be no room for uncertainty, only a choice. Stand or fall back, and what he chose would define everything that followed. The winter closed in with a weight that could be felt in every movement. The cold did not stay at the surface. It reached into the body, slowing reactions, draining strength, making even simple actions harder than they should have been. The ground was unforgiving, frozen in some places, unstable in others, turning every step into a calculation. By this point, Audie Murphy had already seen more than most soldiers were ever meant to endure. Combat was no longer unfamiliar. The tension, the unpredictability, the constant awareness of danger had become part of the rhythm of his days. But what lay ahead would be different. His unit was positioned in a vulnerable area, holding ground that could not be easily reinforced. The line was thin, resources were limited, and the enemy knew it. The pressure began slowly, small engagements. Probing attacks, movements designed to test their response, each one revealing something, each one building toward something larger. Murphy paid attention. He could feel it coming, the way the attacks were timed, the way the enemy shifted positions, the increasing intensity that suggested this was not random, it was preparation, and when it came all at once. The attack began with force. Gunfire broke through the cold silence, followed by explosions that shook the ground beneath them. The enemy advanced in numbers, coordinated, aggressive, pushing forward with the clear intention of breaking through. The unit responded immediately, returning fire, holding position, trying to contain the movement before it became too much to control. But the pressure did not ease, it increased. More fire, more movement, more force behind every push. The line began to strain. Murphy moved where he was needed, supporting positions that were taking the most pressure. He did not wait for instructions. He could see where the risk was, where the line was beginning to weaken. Men were falling, some wounded, some not getting back up. The situation shifted quickly from defense to survival. And then it happened, the order to pull back. The position could not be held. The risk of being overrun was too high. The unit began to retreat, moving as quickly as they could under fire, trying to create distance to regroup to avoid complete collapse. But retreat does not happen cleanly in war. It happens under pressure, under fire, with confusion, and in those moments someone has to hold the line long enough for the others to get out. Murphy understood that without being told. He saw the gap, he saw the timing, and he knew what would happen if no one stepped in. He could have moved with the others, he could have followed the order and pulled back. No one would have questioned it, but he did not. Instead, he turned toward the advancing enemy. The noise of the battlefield closed in around him, but his focus narrowed. The situation was clear. The line was breaking. The retreat needed time, and time had to be bought. He took position. Alone, between his unit and the force moving toward them, the cold no longer mattered. The noise no longer mattered. Only the decision in front of him, hold, or let everything behind him fall apart. And in that moment, without hesitation, he made his choice. He would not fall back, he would stand. And what he was about to do would be something no one there would ever forget, because one man was about to face a force that should have overwhelmed him, and he was not going to move. The retreat was already in motion. Men moved back under pressure, carrying the wounded, trying to create distance from a force that was advancing with speed and coordination. Every second mattered. Every moment gained could mean the difference between regrouping and being completely overrun. And in that space between collapse and survival, Audie Murphy stood alone. The enemy was closing in, numbers that could not be ignored, movement that did not slow, gunfire that continued without pause. Murphy positioned himself where the line had broken, where the pressure was strongest, where there was nothing left between the advancing force and the men pulling back behind him. He opened fire. Controlled, focused, every shot placed with purpose. He was not firing to hold them forever. He was firing to delay, to disrupt, to create just enough resistance to force hesitation, and for a moment it worked. The advance slowed, not stopped, but slowed. The enemy had expected a collapsing line, not resistance, not a single point of defense holding firm when everything else was falling back. Murphy used that moment, adjusted his position, kept firing. The sound of his weapon cut through the chaos, steady and relentless, creating the impression of something larger than what was actually there. But the pressure returned, stronger, closer. Rounds struck near him. Dirt and debris lifted into the air with every impact. The space around him became smaller, more dangerous, more exposed with each passing second. He did not move back. He moved forward into position again. The situation escalated quickly. Enemy forces began to push harder, attempting to break through the resistance he was creating. Their numbers made it clear that this was not a fight he could win in the traditional sense. But that was not the objective. The objective was time, and he was still buying it. Behind him, his unit continued to withdraw, gaining distance, reorganizing, surviving because the pressure was not fully on them. It was on him. Alone, the battlefield narrowed to a single point of focus: his position. His movement, his decision to remain. There were moments when the fire intensified to the point where holding position seemed impossible, when the logical choice would have been to fall back, to preserve what little advantage he still had. But he stayed, because leaving meant exposing everyone behind him, because stopping meant ending the only resistance that remained between order and collapse. And then through the noise and movement, something appeared. A vehicle, damaged, burning. Abandoned in the chaos of the fight. A tank destroyer. Most would have seen it as useless, too exposed, too dangerous to approach, a target more than an advantage, but Murphy saw something else, an opportunity, a way to change the balance even if only for a moment. He moved toward it, under fire, closing the distance between himself and something that could either give him a chance or end everything instantly. The flames rose from the vehicle, heat cutting through the cold air, smoke marking its position clearly to anyone watching. It was the last place anyone would expect a soldier to move toward. But Murphy did not hesitate. because what he was about to do was not about safety. It was about holding the line long enough for others to live. And as he reached the burning machine, the situation shifted from desperate defense to something far more dangerous. Because now he was about to turn that fire into a weapon, and every eye on that battlefield would be drawn to it. The heat from the burning tank destroyer could be felt before he even reached it. Flames moved across the metal, thick smoke rising into the air, marking its position for anyone looking in that direction. It was exposed, dangerous, and unstable. The kind of place every instinct tells you to avoid. But Audie Murphy was not looking for safety. He was looking for a way to hold. He climbed onto the vehicle. The metal was hot beneath him, the fire close enough to remind him that this was not something that could last. At any moment, the ammunition inside could ignite. The entire machine could become an explosion, and still he stayed. Mounted on the tank destroyer was a machine gun, heavy, powerful, and now it was his. He took position behind it, fully exposed, with no cover and no protection from the fire that was still burning beside him. From where he stood, he could see the movement of the enemy more clearly now. Advancing, spreading, preparing to close the distance and finish what they had started. They did not expect what came next. Murphy opened fire. The sound was immediate and overwhelming, cutting through everything else on the battlefield. The weapon carried power that changed the dynamic instantly. What had been a single point of resistance became something much harder to push through. The advance stopped. Not completely, but enough. The enemy forces hesitated, adjusting to something they had not planned for. A lone soldier positioned on a burning vehicle, firing with precision and control as if he had nothing to lose. From their perspective, it did not make sense. From his perspective, it did not need to. He continued firing, short bursts, controlled movement, watching where they shifted, where they tried to advance, where they attempted to regroup. Each time they moved, he responded. Each time they pushed, he forced them back. The battlefield centered around that position. Every round fired in his direction struck close. The vehicle took hits. The ground around him broke apart under the impact. The risk of explosion grew with every second, and still he did not leave, because every moment he remained there was another moment his unit could get further away. Another moment gained, another chance to survive. The fire beside him continued to burn, growing, spreading across the surface of the vehicle. The heat intensified. The danger became more immediate. He was standing on something that could end at any second, but he did not step down. He stayed in position, kept firing, refused to give ground. Time stretched, each second heavier than the last, each decision more final. The enemy continued to test the position, probing, pushing, trying to find a way through. But every attempt met resistance. From one man, standing where no one should have been, doing something no one expected. And slowly something began to change. The momentum shifted, not completely, but enough. Enough to break the rhythm of the attack, enough to create space, enough to give the men behind him the time they needed. But time was running out, because the fire was getting closer. The risk of explosion was no longer distant. It was immediate. And the question was no longer whether he could hold the position. It was how much longer he could stay there before everything around him gave way. Because sooner or later the fire would reach its limit. And when it did, there would be no more chances. Only the outcome of the choice he had already made. The fire crept closer with every passing second. The heat intensified, pressing against him from the side, rising through the metal beneath his feet. Smoke thickened the air, making each breath heavier. The tank destroyer was no longer just damaged. It was unstable. At any moment, the ammunition stored inside could ignite. And yet Audie Murphy did not move. He stayed behind the machine gun, focused, steady, aware of everything in front of him and nothing else. The battlefield had narrowed to a single purpose: hold the line, keep the pressure off the men behind him. Buy time no matter the cost. He kept firing, each burst controlled, each movement deliberate. The enemy continued to advance in waves, testing the position, trying to break through what should have been an impossible defense. But something about it forced them to hesitate. From their perspective, it made no sense. A lone soldier, fully exposed, standing on a burning vehicle, refusing to fall back, returning fire with precision as if the danger around him did not exist. They adjusted. They tried to flank, to move around his position, to find a weakness. Murphy saw it happening. And he responded, shifting the aim of the weapon, cutting off movement before it could develop, forcing them to stay back, to slow down, to reconsider every step forward. The ground around him continued to break apart under incoming fire. Impacts struck closer. The sound of rounds hitting metal echoed sharply, each one a reminder of how little stood between him and the end of it all. Still, he did not step down, because stepping down meant giving up the only advantage he had: the height. The visibility, the ability to control the space in front of him. Time passed, though it did not feel like time. It felt like pressure, constant, unrelenting. The fire beside him spread further, the flames rising higher, the heat becoming almost unbearable. The danger of explosion was no longer something that might happen. It was something that would happen. The question was when, and whether he would still be there when it did. But even with that knowledge, his focus did not break. Because behind him, the retreat had created distance. The men were no longer in immediate danger of being overrun. The line, which had nearly collapsed, had been held long enough to stabilize. The objective had been achieved. He had done what he set out to do. And yet he did not leave immediately, because the enemy was still there, still watching, still waiting for the moment when the resistance would stop. Murphy held just a little longer, just enough to make it clear that the position was not weak, that the line had not broken, that pushing forward would cost more than they were prepared to give. And then when the moment finally came, when the fire reached a point where staying any longer would mean certain death, he made his move. He stepped down, left the burning vehicle behind, and moved back toward his unit, alive, wounded, but still moving. The battlefield behind him marked by what had just taken place, an advance that had been stopped. A collapse that had been prevented, a single position that had held when everything else was falling apart. But the story did not end there, because what he had just done was not the end of the fight. It was only one moment in a war that was still unfolding, and even after facing something that should have ended it all, he was not finished, because soon he would be asked to step forward again. Not alone this time, but as something more than just a soldier holding the line. He would be asked to lead, and what he had just proven would follow him into the next battle. The distance he had helped create gave the unit something they had nearly lost. Time to regroup, time to breathe, time to reorganize after a moment that could have ended everything. But war does not pause for recovery. The pressure returns, and when it does, it demands more. Audie Murphy rejoined his unit carrying the weight of what had just happened. The physical toll was already there. Wounds that had not yet been fully treated, exhaustion that went beyond fatigue. But there was no space to step away from it, because the situation had not stabilized completely. It had only shifted. The enemy had been slowed, not defeated. The line had been held, not secured. What came next would determine whether that effort would mean survival or simply delay the inevitable. Orders came quickly. They would not continue retreating. They would hold. And then they would move forward again. For many, that order carried hesitation. The memory of what had just happened was still fresh. The intensity of the attack, the pressure, the losses, it was not something easily set aside. But something had changed, not just in Murphy, in the men around him. They had seen what one man was willing to do to hold the line. They had seen what it looked like to stand when stepping back would have been easier. And that changes how men move forward. Murphy was no longer just part of the unit. He had become a point of reference, not through words, through action. When positions were reassigned and movement was planned, attention turned to him, not because he demanded it, but because it had been earned. The kind of trust that forms in moments where everything is at risk. He moved with them as they prepared to advance again. This time not as someone reacting to the situation, but as someone helping shape it. The ground ahead was still contested. The enemy remained in position, watching, waiting for the next movement. The outcome was not certain, it never is, but the difference now was in the mindset. They were no longer pulling back under pressure, they were stepping forward with intention. Murphy took position where the risk was highest, where the line could break again if not held, where leadership was not about giving orders but about being present when it mattered most. The advance began, careful at first, measured. Each step forward taken with awareness of what could happen. The enemy responded. Gunfire returned. Resistance met movement, but this time the line did not break, it held, because the men holding it had seen what was possible when someone refused to give ground. Murphy moved through the fight with the same focus he had shown before, supporting positions, closing gaps, acting without hesitation when something needed to be done. The difference now was not in what he did. It was in what others did around him. They held longer, moved stronger, responded faster, because they believed the line could hold, because they had seen it happen. The fight stretched on, but the balance had shifted, not completely, but enough to push forward, enough to take ground that had nearly been lost, enough to turn a moment of survival into a moment of control. And as the engagement continued, something became clear. What had happened on that burning vehicle was not just an act of survival. It was a turning point for the unit, for the battle, and for the man at the center of it, because moments like that do not stay contained. They carry forward, they shape what comes next, and what came next would bring something different, not just another fight, but recognition, not immediate, not in the middle of the chaos, but something that would follow, because actions like that do not disappear, they are seen. They are remembered, and eventually they are acknowledged, but even that would not define the full weight of what had happened, because what matters most is not what is said after. It is what was done in the moment, and the question that remained was not whether it would be recognized. It was how far the impact of that moment would reach, because what he had done was more than hold a line. He had changed the outcome, and the world would soon begin to understand just how much. Word of what had happened did not spread all at once. It moved quietly at first, from one soldier to another, from one unit to the next, not as a story told for attention, but as something that had been seen, something that had been lived through. The kind of moment that stays with those who were there because they understand what it took. Audie Murphy did not speak about it in the way others might have. There was no need to explain. The men who had been on that battlefield already knew. They had seen the position, they had felt the pressure. They had lived through the retreat that could have turned into something far worse, and they knew what had stopped it. The reports began to move upward through the chain of command, accounts of the engagement, descriptions of the resistance, details that, when read, seemed almost impossible to fully grasp. One man, holding a position alone, under direct fire, standing on a burning vehicle, refusing to fall back. It did not fit into what was expected. It went beyond it, and yet it was real. Recognition in war does not come easily. It must be earned through actions that stand above the rest, actions that change outcomes, that carry weight beyond a single moment. This was one of those moments. Murphy continued with his unit, moving forward as the campaign progressed. The battles did not stop. The danger did not disappear. What had happened did not remove him from the reality of war. He was still there, still moving, still part of every operation that followed, but something had changed, not in the way he saw himself, but in the way others saw him. He was no longer just another soldier in the line. He had become a symbol of what could be done when everything was at risk. And that carries weight. It influences decisions. It shapes how others respond. Because when men believe something is possible, they act differently. They hold longer. They move with more purpose. They do not give in as quickly when pressure rises. Murphy did not ask for that role, but it was there, built from action, reinforced by what others had witnessed. As time passed, the recognition that had begun quietly became something more formal. The process of acknowledging what had happened moved forward, step by step, through a system that was designed to identify acts that went beyond duty, acts that defined something greater. And eventually, his name would be placed among those who had performed one of the highest levels of courage recognized in the United States military. But even that would not fully capture the reality of the moment, because medals and recognition come after. They are reflections. What matters most is what happened when there was no audience, when there was no certainty, when there was only a decision, stand or step back. Murphy had chosen to stand. And that choice had consequences far beyond that single battlefield. It had saved lives. It had held a line that could have broken. It had changed the outcome of a moment that could have gone in a very different direction. But the full meaning of that would only become clear with time, because stories like this do not stay in one place. They move. They grow. They become something larger than the moment they came from. And soon, what had happened on that battlefield would reach beyond the men who were there. It would reach a nation, and it would force people to look at one question. What does it really mean for one man to stand alone and refuse to give in? In time, the story reached beyond the battlefield. What had been lived by a few became known by many. What had been witnessed in chaos was now spoken of with clarity. The account of what Audie Murphy had done moved through the ranks, through official reports, and eventually into the awareness of an entire nation. It was no longer just a moment in war. It had become a symbol of something larger. Recognition followed. Not quickly, not lightly, but with the full weight of what the moment represented. Murphy would be awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. A distinction reserved for actions that go beyond duty, beyond expectation, beyond what most would believe possible. But even that did not define the full story, because what happened on that battlefield was not done for recognition. There was no audience when he climbed onto that burning tank destroyer, no ceremony when he chose to stay, no guarantee that anyone would even know. There was only the moment, the pressure, the decision, and the will to act. That is where the story truly lives. Not in the medal, but in the choice. The kind of choice that cannot be trained into a person, cannot be forced, cannot be demanded. It comes from something deeper, something built over time, from hardship, from responsibility, from a life that teaches you long before the battlefield that stepping forward is sometimes the only option. Murphy returned home after the war to a country that now knew his name. A country that saw him as a hero, as a symbol of courage, as proof of what one person could do when everything is at stake. But like many who go through war, what he carried did not stay behind. The battles end. The memories do not. He would go on to live a life that continued beyond the uniform, stepping into a different world, one that tried to understand what men like him had experienced. But the truth of what happened in those moments could never be fully translated. Because it was not something meant to be explained. It was something that was lived. And what he lived through left a mark that recognition alone could not erase. Still, his story remains, not just as a record of what happened, but as a reminder that in the middle of chaos, when everything is uncertain, when the outcome is unclear and the pressure is at its highest, one person can still make a decision that changes everything. That strength is not always about numbers. That courage is not always loud. And that sometimes the difference between collapse and survival comes down to a single individual who refuses to step back. The soldiers who faced him that day could not believe what they were seeing. One man, holding his ground, turning a moment of defeat into resistance, and resistance into survival. And that is how a young man who was once told he was too small, too light, and not enough, became something far greater than anyone expected. Not because he was chosen, but because, when the moment came, he chose to stand. And in doing so, he became a living answer to a question that echoes far beyond the battlefield. What is one man capable of when he refuses to give in?